First, a quick poll of the audience. How many of you are in startups or SMEs in Vietnam? How many of you are in startups and SMEs in Southeast Asia? That's Vietnam Plus. There should be more hands now than last time. How many of you like to invest in things when they're small and see them get really big and sustainable? That should be everybody. All right, I still see a couple of you are asleep, but most of you are here. Good. All right, so usually when people are thinking about startups and SMEs or thinking about building businesses, getting their first customers and so on, so why think about ESG? Why is that important? That's what this panel is about today. Let's go in the order that we talked about the other day. So let's first talk to Akil, who with Temasek Trust ran a very interesting survey. Please introduce yourself and then share about your recent findings.
Yeah, happy to. Very nice to see many familiar faces and some new ones. So my name is Akil. I work at Temasek Trust, in particular the Center for Impact Investing and Practices. Here I lead an impact accelerator program called the Amplifier, so essentially supporting early stage ventures, very much on point with the theme we're discussing today, as well as I've led a study on supply chain sustainability, which I'd be sharing a little bit more about. Prior to joining the trust a couple of years ago, I've spent time both in the impact investing world as well as on the operator side with a tech startup based out of Nairobi in Kenya. So yeah, it's great to be here. I think I'll dive right into maybe the study findings itself. But maybe just to set some context, the center essentially tries to sort of look into resonating with the stakeholders on the ground. And one way to do that is to find the voices from the ground up. To facilitate that, we've done a few deep dives, particularly on supply chain related topics in the last 12 months. We've got some of our partners in the room who supported us in that process as well. We covered about 3,500 SMEs as part of a survey that we conducted across 4 industries, which included food, consumer goods, electronics, and tourism. And this was split across 4 different countries. So it included Vietnam, where we also had close to about a little less than 800 companies. So we got really rich data insights and sort of depth into what were the behind the scenes thinking for many of these ventures. I think one self-selection bias that would naturally take place in a study like this is we looked at companies that were exporting or were looking at serving international markets. So they were inherently, the results bore out inherently some level of awareness. But if you think of it in 3 different buckets of awareness, perhaps policy at a company or a firm or a team level, and then implementation of these practices, there was actually not so much direct correlation. So across the region, about 70% of our survey respondents had mentioned that companies had either moderate or strong awareness of ESG. Vietnam actually stood out above the average, the regional average, so it was about 75%. There was only one other country in the region that was above that. And then in terms of other policy intervention, 3 out of 5 companies had actually indicated that they had some level of policy making that's taking place for ESG related matters at a company or a firm level. But if you take that to then practice implementation, that's where we saw a divide. So we did see some good news, which was that at least 84% of the companies were responding that they had implemented 1 out of the 21 practices that we had surveyed them about. But then actually that's just scratching the surface. So there's more to slice this with the motivations and the challenges, and there's a few sort of statistics that I will bring out, but this is the headlines of things we've been observing. There's a lot, I think, within E, S, and G that is not necessarily perceived as inherently benefit sometimes to businesses. So interested to scratch the surface of that with my fellow panelists.
Yeah. No, that certainly makes a lot of sense. As we've seen with the tariffs coming from the US, Southeast Asia is a major trading partner for the US as well as others. So to be able to access these overseas markets makes sense. I'm curious, accessing the overseas market seems to be a motivator for a lot of your respondents. What stops them from going farther than just scratching the surface? What are some of the discoveries there?
Yeah, maybe just pulling out some stats here.
Yeah.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay. Perfect. So I think this is a slide on, just to make sure. Yeah, this is basically talking about the commercial considerations, right? And I think a lot of what we saw, and I think it's between 30 to 40% depending on the market we might be in, it's either coming down to increasing the revenue for these companies or reducing the cost, so long-term efficiency play. Between the two, as long as you can address at least one of these factors, that would be incentive enough for a company to implement such practices. And one interesting finding across all of this was that actually country, when we did some regression analysis, country actually mattered the most out of all the other factors. So size of the company aside, industry aside, it was the specific nuances of the country that would make it more likely to either have awareness or implementation of ESG practices than not. What does that explain us, right? So in terms of Vietnam's context, it was about the interconnectedness of trade that would necessitate the adoption of some of these practices. In some other markets, which were serving largely domestic audiences, the rationale of adoption is actually less towards commercial, more towards things like addressing talent needs, or looking at sort of ways in which companies could better sort of address the compliance or the local regulations that their government or policymakers might be asking for. So I think it was a little bit of sort of nuance in the region itself. We saw that between Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam, there was the strongest inclination to cater to international markets. Now, there is, of course, I think, a lot of it has been thrown off track in the last 3 months. But I think if you think about MNCs that have implemented some of these practices, what one inference one could take out of that is that because companies have already committed to addressing their Scope 3 requirements, for instance, which will affect the SMEs eventually, that it's very hard to reverse that decision in the short run. Because companies take between 12 to 36 months to implement some of these practices. And if the administration or other things change over time, it's very difficult to go flipping back and forth. So I think some level of, we've heard quite a fair bit in previous panels, whether that's from the tourism sector or other industries. I think ultimately, if companies have committed to go in that direction, there would be an incentive to stick with it over the medium term. Mm-hmm. The other factor is that if the costs could be shown to be decreased, you don't actually need the other incentive. So you could work it off the bottom lines in the other direction instead. But yeah, there's more that we can discuss, but I'll also let my panelists.
Thank you for that start. You just spoke about access to export markets as a major factor, but that's not the only major factor. Also, access to international capital markets has been a driving factor. So Cheryl, would love to hear your bio for everybody, as well as what S&P has been doing around this fact.
Thanks, Eddie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Cheryl. I'm an account director with S&P Global Sustainable One. S&P Global, as many of you may know, for their credit ratings, but actually S&P is also a really large company. We provide a lot of financial data as well as sustainability data to banks, asset managers, asset owners, which they use our data typically to screen for their investments, due diligence. They also use this to report on the finance emissions of their portfolio, as well as to launch products. So we will also, our ESG scores or our sustainability data also informs indexes such as the Dow Jones Best in Class Index, but also a lot of asset managers, they create their own in-house index to benchmark the fund's performance. So that's a short snippet. And maybe just to share a little bit about maybe why I'm here. So I'm here to provide the perspective from an ESG data provider, how banks, investors, asset managers use these ESG scores and why it would be relevant for SMEs or companies to invest the time and effort to do it. Should I?
Please,
okay.
Yeah.
So maybe just, so maybe quickly just to share, S&P, we cover over 20,000 companies on our database, and each year we get the ESG scores from something called the Corporate Sustainability Assessment. So that's a 100 to 130 questionnaire, which we invite over 13,000 companies on an annual basis to participate. In our score, the higher the score, the better it is. But we will collect it. We have over 62 industry-specific questionnaires. So if let's say you are a bank, you would take the same questionnaire as all the banks globally to do this. So this allows you to be very benchmarkable and comparable. And this survey has been around for over 25 years. And typically how banks use this is that they would most banks would actually create their own proprietary in-house ESG score. So they would buy our data because we already collected this primary data from these companies to blend it into their own in-house ESG score along with other data sets. And how asset managers use this as well is that they may use this to screen for potential eligible companies to include in a certain fund. So maybe like a climate resilience fund or a ASEAN best-in-class kind of fund. So yeah, this is it's for SMEs. If you're not a part of the invited universe of 13,000 companies, you can commission a rating from S&P. And so we often see companies who may be getting ready for an IPO. They might be interested in doing something like that because it can help you raise your profile, and you can use this for investor relations purposes. And to attract capital and certain types of investors that may be interested in that.
Which leads me to a question. Large corporations have the bandwidth and the tracking to do 130-question surveys and major sustainability reports. Smaller companies, medium-sized companies may have a harder time to get started. How are you encouraging SMEs to engage with you in this product?
Yeah, we're laughing because Akil asked me the same question earlier. So it is a journey. We recognize that. And how often we do this is we partner with industry associations, with stock exchanges to do capacity building workshops. So typically it would start from something small as learning about what are the reporting frameworks. So right now, the market is all looking at ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Boards, IFRS S1 and S2. So we do those workshops to introduce, the framework, as well as, you should start with a materiality assessment and then do your GHG footprinting. And then when you're ready, maybe you look at a bit of scenario analysis for physical risk and transition risk. And then, for the even more advanced corporates, some of them are looking at reporting on nature risks and impacts. So it is a journey. So we typically we have products called a sustainability starter pack to help corporates just getting ready on this journey to start off with the baby steps.
Thanks. Did you have something?
I just want to actually add something
Yeah.
about it. So I think the building on the point about the impact expertise that may exist internally and externally in the capacity and the resources, right? So one interesting model that through this study we unearthed was a CSO as a shared service model. And I think it points to the fact that there isn't a need for an SME to have a full-time CSO in every single context, right? So I think if industry associations play a role where there can be a shared resource that's made available to multiple SMEs in one instance, that could potentially be sort of ways in which, the ecosystem can come together a bit. So yeah, just adding to that.
Vicky is an entrepreneur in the trenches. These surveys, these data collection questionnaires, these may sound a little far off. How has ESG affected your business? And does it actually open up access to capital?
So for our case, so quick introduction. So I'm the co-founder of a company called Cricket One. So we specialize in farming and processing cricket into different food and pet food ingredients. And our business model is mainly still 95% over exporting ingredients to Europe, US, and some other developed countries in Asia. For food application, also pet food applications. And then recently, like 1.5 years, really, we wanted to have more influence on the consumer side. So we also have a spin-off called RecRec, where we introduced cricket-based or cricket-fortified FMCG product. So we started with chips, crackers, and now we are launching instant ramen, which is getting closer to mainstream diet. So go back to your question again to how we look at ESG. So for us, ESG framework is more like giving us access into the competition, competitive market. So we want, most of the case, we were asked to provide a live assessment report, life cycle assessment report, and where we're reflecting most of what would be the emission, what would be the intake consumptions of natural resources, and so on, per kilo of protein that we produce. And also we have to also calculate the offset of the international transportation, because our main market is a global market. So yes, one hand is a compulsory request from the buyers, But on the other hand, it's also an advantage for us to compete with the other suppliers in Europe or US, where the natural condition of the climate are not very much favorable for them to farm insect. But that is for the commercial side. In terms of the capital access, maybe we don't give a very good appetite for VC fund. When they look
Excuse
into
me.
that, you was one of the rare. So if you look into the cap table, you're actually the only one financial institute invest into. The rest is like family office and high net worth individual. Except when it comes to FMCG, yes, we draw a lot more attentions. So when it really depends on what kind of capital that we could address or what kind of capital that we can tap into, that ESG framework play a different role. So of course, it's like for high net worth and so family office, they have a very strong threshold of ESG compliance, social compliance, and so on. So those also give us extra points to get tap into them or get being approached by them. But on the practical way, we look at ESG more like a framework for us to optimize our operation, also to de-risk. End of the day, when we look into the ESG framework, it's not a certificate or it's some sort of like announcement of our brand name, but we perceive it more like a way for us. For example, we at the end of the day, when it comes to ESG, we are more like on the E element, like environment. So what would be the impact of our operations on the biodiversity, and then with the emissions, with the consumptions of water and land. And then for the S, most of our system very much like either like semi-automated or almost automation. So we don't have a very huge amounts of employees like production company like garment textile, for example. So that S element is not too strong, like too, let's say, critical for us. But then the G is very important. So it's come to governance. But our governance here is not more about the management transparency, but more about how transparent we are toward the consumer, toward our clients, and how well we govern our operation to de-risk the foodborne, the food safety issues, and so on. So look down into the whole ESG model is for us to de-risk and to optimize the cost. So based on your research just now, so it's a majority part, like almost 47%, the response was to optimize cost and operation related purpose. So this is how we perceive that. And of course, we don't have access, and so we don't have the resources to fulfill 30 questionnaire from S&P. And also the cost of reporting also another level. So for us, what we do is like we approach it in a different way, a little bit out of the box. So there's a lot of public data about like CO2, the methane emission in cricket farming. And what we do is like we run an internal assessment where we develop a sort of like breathing room to isolate cricket from the surrounding, to calculate and monitor the emissions. And then what we did was we built a cloud platform with algorithm. Inject with our data for the past almost 8 years in cricket farming. We're not going to say we are master of that, but I think we have quite a enormous amounts of cricket farming. And we use real-time sensor to monitor everything. So we monitor the emissions of CO2 methane. We monitor the water use during farming into processing, and how much water we collected during processing and how we treat the water. We also measure real-time sensors and also calculation how much from our renewable energy system. We use both like broiler from solar panel and also like some other like battery. And then we compare how much we can substitute with the national grid during the big and off seasons. So this is what we do for ESG. And then every year we just have to calibrate our sensors instead of waiting for the report.
Yeah, no time to write the report because you're actually doing the stuff. So that's
actually, like, if you go to our platform, it's called www.esg.cricket1.asia. You can track real time how much is of the whole emission and consumption to produce 1 kilo of each type of product, real time.
Very cool. Nick, you have had exposure to hundreds or thousands of startups in Australia in the climate space. How much of what Bicky has been experiencing here and doing here matches with the patterns you've seen in your startups.
Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Mick Lebinskas. Spent 30 years in technology with the last 8 years in sustainability, clean tech and climate technology. 4 years ago, I accidentally started Climate Salad, which became a community of 700 climate technology companies in Australia. So almost getting to 1,000. That was our 2030 goal, which we set 4 years ago, which we thought was crazy ambitious. Going back to the last panel around ambition versus actually just getting in and getting it done. We have now about 120 climate tech investors in Australia, including Ben, who's from Investable Climate Tech Fund, and Kate here, who's from Ox Capital, who's with us this week. And our focus was actually Australia produces quite good technology, but has a very small and risk-averse market versus US, Asia, and Europe overall. So I know that seems like complaining that Australia is a small country seems a bit odd given the size of it, but it is really difficult to find early customers in Australia for a lot of those reasons. So I think when I look at the question, I think the is it the ultimate competitive advantage? I think it's actually, it will be, and the biggest question is timing. And the horrible thing about someone who's been studying this for a long time is obviously from the environment perspective, we need it to happen very, very, very quickly. But again, picking on for the last panel, doing it step by step and realising we're changing like 1 trillion tiny transactions around the world. And my motivation to get into this is we need at least 1 million new innovations to get back to nature positive. So we need these, but changing the whole world and the systems that are developed over 200 years in like a 20-year period, even with all the investment in the world and all the best entrepreneurs in the world, given the cycles and the corporates and the incumbents, that's hard. What we're doing is really, really hard. So that's the big thing that I work with entrepreneurs on, is actually trying to get the pace right. The pace of growing. Being too early is as bad as being wrong. So getting the pace and then also working out that climate tech funding is absolutely very, very completely opposite from software or e-commerce. It's got to be done very, very differently. We're working out a new way to do this. So we need people who have the appetite to invest in cricket companies. I love that pun. That's the pun of the panel so far. And we need to work with big companies. We need to work with data. Like, we all need to collaborate. And I actually think we've got the critical mass of good people working on this now. And it's a matter of being impatient for action and patient for results. And that's what we're doing. A big part of this, me being here, is because I think Vietnam is a great market for trade and partnerships with Australia. We have huge opportunities in Australia to use crickets as proteins, and we actually need to be doing advanced battery manufacturing, which we can't do in Australia. So I think there are enormous opportunities between our two countries.
That's great, which is a good seg to a different angle. We find that at a lot of ESG panel discussions, it's about risk, but we started off about upside, right? But let us now bring it over to risk. Southeast Asia is, in the tech and SME space, startup and SME space is also vulnerable to the same kinds of ESG risks that we see in conventional businesses, and most notably in the past 6 months, eFishery, which, for those who are not familiar, is a Indonesian-based company that was serving shrimp farms across not just Indonesia, but other parts of Southeast Asia. And they recently went under due to a discovery of substantial fraud. Whether people were directly invested, as Temasek, or not actually directly involved, but are in the same space, like Cricket One, it has an impact. So I want to turn to the panel. What's your take on what happened with eFishery and what it means for ESG adoption in Southeast Asia in particular? Yeah.
Okay. Well, firstly, to distinguish myself from Temasek, because the trust and the Temasek, while interlinked closely, they are two different entities. But I think it points to the bigger question of just how much honest scaffolding is there, right? In many of these transactions and deals that do take place, there's, as investors, we tend to put a lot of pressure in terms of, showing the growth at any cost and comparing that to maybe operational depth And it's not true for every entrepreneur, but I think it is a bit of a watershed moment, right? Because every time there is a transaction, or anytime there is any company that is introduced to us in the agri-tech field, you kind of have to think, okay, what would the optics of that look like, given the timing of everything else that has taken place? So I think it has had a little bit of a dip in terms of just the sentiment of the overall ecosystem and the perception it would have around agri-tech companies in Southeast Asia. But I guess just going back to the research and the Amplifier program that I had mentioned earlier, two specific instances and thoughts come to mind, right? So one around the governance practices. So I think if you have to build long-term credibility, there's got to be a series of steps companies have to take: instituting board, getting anti-corruption practices sort of streamlined into the company, having mentors, that sort of support and guide the company through that process. So for the study that we did, we had about 7 of these practices mapped out of the 21. It turned out that actually companies in Vietnam had a higher average. So out of the 21 practices, 7 tend to be the average number of practices companies implement. For Vietnam, it was 11. So this is across E, S, and G. In terms of G, it was a lot lower. So it came down to about, I think, 2.2 or 2.5, something in that sort of range. And I use decimals because these are all averaged out. But sure. I think it shows sort of out of the 7 governance practices, it was less than half that were being implemented. Now, some of it can come down to, is there a governance mechanism around it? Are investors liable to put that pressure? The way we do that on revenue growth estimates, should we do the same for impact practices and sort of impact reporting? I know reporting is not easy. And to support that, I think the ecosystem also has to have a sort of a place. So one of the things the trust has started doing is to run a program that supports impact ventures. There's an element of injecting catalytic capital, but it also comes with supporting companies early on in their journey. So these are companies that might be facing what we call the valley of death. Require the runway funding wise, but also connections to off-takers and business development. So can there be opportunities at that early stage of the company itself that we institute such conventions where you're expected to sort of build that ethic early on in the journey of the company, as opposed to when you're raising from an institutional investor? So I think that's sort of one way we're sort of seeing, are there ways to step in and sort of support the ecosystem in Southeast Asia in particular? But it's not an easy question to answer.
Cheryl has more.
Yeah, so maybe just to add, in our ESG scores, fraud is essentially would fall clearly under governance. So we have questions which will ask you what is your policies, your procedures on money laundering, on bribery and corruption, and you have to link your evidence to those policies. We also ask you things about your CEO compensation plan. How is the compensation plan? What are the KPIs attached to the CEO? But my personal opinion, a lot of this is actually, it's not unique to eFishery. We have seen WeWork not too long ago, Theranos as well. A lot of it is actually governance. Sometimes it's because there is a big anchor investor that kind of like joins and invests in, and then everybody gets excited, wants to pile in, and then they don't do their own due diligence. I think you need to do your own due diligence because it has happened time and time again. FTX as well, so yes. Quite a lot, yeah.
Oh, okay. So
no need to, but yeah, if you want to.
No, I mean it's like so actually, I met the founders of eFishery probably probably 10 years ago. So I had a chance to come down to Jakarta, and then he also went to Jakarta to see me. So it was a very brief meeting. So when they announced the last rounds of funding with the valuation, actually I had butterfly in my stomach, because like for an architect startup in Asia, like South Asia, became a unicorn. I think we are in like every startup, we all want to, let's say, look up to such a potential and also like very promising startup, right? So for us, we also feel kind of proud for the situation back then. And also like, and then after what happened, falling down of the business with the reason behind the whole thing with the governance. So yes, it did leave quite an impact on other agri-tech startup in the region. And as you were sharing about what would be the framework startup using, and also with the pressures of growth, it has to show growth over the time. And of course, it's like we always make a joke. Is like after we receive the funding, the investment, there's actually a lot of people sit on our head, right? So we do also have our duties and also our responsibility toward every single dollars of investment. So it would be very hard for me to understand why they had to do it, because I'm not in the game, or I had nothing to do to understand why. But it did leave an impact. And in terms of the governance, let's say the governmental roles into a framework, we are just like a company operated in the country. So there's a macro and micro regulation jurisdiction, but it's come down to every single individual company operation. Then I think it's a lot of work to do. And yeah, so that's all I can say, just to give a bit of the voice.
Yeah, so I think a few years ago I was pessimistic about our future. Then I became optimistic, and now I'm certain that we're going to get there. But I'm absolutely certain it's also going to be really, really messy. And I think this is a part of it. I mean, let's not even talk about carbon offsetting and the value of a tree and where it's going to be around. But we've got to work that stuff out. Like we've had 6,000 years to manage money, and still that's a problem. And now all of a sudden we have to really value the environment, which surprisingly enough, because we have to breathe, drink water and eat, we should have cared about a little bit more. But there is just so much to change. But I think if I think about the internet, and I think about back to pets.com, they weren't wrong. They were just early, and selling pet food now online globally, including cricket-based pet food, has thousands of other bits of infrastructure that support it. So you've got to build the platform as you're building every individual business, and you've got to build the way to measure it, and you've got to build the financing models. You've got to build all those components around it. The massive advantage ESG has over the internet as a platform is it's significantly larger, it's significantly more important, and it's policy pushed. There was no policy saying, my goodness, if we don't get the internet rolled out and everyone using Grab, then goodness me, like we're going to be in real trouble, right? Like, so I think there are significant advantages for driving it, but that also creates pressure, and also means that we've got this transition from impact being this special thing, which is really important, to being normalised. And I think the time when we actually stop talking about it and going, wow, this is a big exciting new thing, and it's just like it's the opposite. It's strange when it's not climate positive or not good for the environment. I think that's when we're closer to breaking through.
Thanks, everybody. Back to Vicky's sentiments. Yeah, it's the first thing we remind folks when people talk about, oh, well, e-fishery means the death of whatever agri-tech in Southeast Asia. I'm like, come on, it's not just agri-tech, it is not just Southeast Asia. Anytime, anywhere there's a chance to make money, there's somebody potentially trying to take advantage of it in the wrong way. So, yeah, definitely hard in the near term, but I've known you for most of your entrepreneurial journey. I know you're battling through. Mick, what you just shared about when things get to the point where we're not talking about these topics anymore, and because we're doing it automatically, that's great. So Vicky shared that the us on Cricket One, they don't do much, it's not as much of a story for them, but actually, to me, an important part of the Cricket One story is the women's economic empowerment. Vicky is a woman co-founder in what is still a very male-dominated ecosystem here in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Another agri-tech company that we backed over the last few years started in less than 3 years ago, also woman-led, woman-owned, from 0 to 100 mil top-line run rate revenue over that time. There's a guy in the back who is in the senior leadership team back over there. So yeah, although there are dark spots, real challenges, like we've seen with e-fishery, like you've seen in your surveys and some of the companies you've worked with, there are also these great opportunities. So, so we have seen the dark, we have seen the light. How do we get the rest of the way there? What are some of the, like one or two, we can go down, start from Mick's end, I guess. What's at least one thing that we have to get right in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I think the diversity side is really, really important. I think we need to develop new technologies, but technology is never enough. We need to also change mindsets at the same time. And I think embedding diversity in the absolute core of environmental technology and nature-first technology is really important. The other thing I'd say about diversity is we will not get this solved without the younger generation getting involved. They're environmental natives. They don't have to. They're not trying to do less harm. They're trying to they inherently built into them is actually to work with the environment in a positive way. So I think that's a really big opportunity for us, but it's hard because all the inertia is against that. So in Australia, 35% of our climate tech companies have a female founder, but 3% of capital goes to companies with a female founder. It's just like wildly off. We've got lots of young people starting companies, but most capital goes to people over 40. So there's a opportunity that to actually really push and drive diversity across all of this, and also diversity across the world. Like environmental problems do not stop at the border. This is a way to connect the world in a really positive sense again. So that to me, the inherently built-in diversity into everything we do is critical.
So let's go down to me again, Eddie. Thank you. So of course, it's like we are for the past almost 9 years. So we've been trying to do something that people don't understand why, like changing the whole habitants and also like the whole practice and common sense of food and ideas of food. So what we do is like. We are not trying to really force into the mouths of people the whole piece of whole chunks of cricket. We're trying to extract only the beauties of the ingredient. And at the end of the day, if we look down into what we eat on the packaging, there's a lot of things coming from the sources that we don't know. And also, it's breaking down into different ingredients that even we can read it, but we have no idea what it is. So for cricket, or let's say the insect protein industry, we're trying to provide a wholesome solutions. And what you can do is like to harmonize the option we have to live a better, more responsible lifestyle. So I think, as you said, is like when we stop talking about insect protein or cricket protein, it means it become mainstream, or people don't accept it. But of course, I tend to look on the bright side. That's why I was still sitting here. So, but for us, if it's all come at a cost to be responsible and to be sustainable. That's why a grass straw costs more, like 10 times more than a plastic straw, right? So, but then we still need to do something, or small contribution lead into a big change. So for us, like we're still trying to manage and trying to get our way to get closer to the table of consumers. So with our technologies, without an ecosystem or without a platform, we cannot do that. We are doing. I think I'm very proud to talk about my team who are doing a very good job at the upstream production where we produce ingredient. But there's also a lot of contribution needed from the downstream production technologies, food engineering, to realize and so to like introduce the final consumer what actually can be accepted by them. So yeah, harmonize so we cannot stop talking about it.
Thanks. We might have time for a question after this. So think of your question while we go down the rest of the line here.
Sure, yeah, same actually with Vicky. Harmonization, conversions. We don't want to be creating many new taxonomies, many new reporting frameworks, many new ESG standards and questionnaires, because otherwise there'll be too many, and then it's not benchmarkable, and then investors won't use it because there's just too many differences. So I think it's the same, be it in sustainable finance taxonomies, be it in frameworks, or also in the carbon markets. I think that's also a place we haven't really talked about, but yeah, the carbon markets, that side, they also have, every country is coming up with their own framework. So I think we need to converge, harmonize, so that we're using one standard or common standards. Yeah.
I think we should flip the question a little bit, right? Because the question is sustainability the ultimate competitive advantage? And I feel that this is kicking the can on just the SME or the startup themselves. Actually, there's a role for the wider ecosystem to play, and I urge the investors in the room and other ecosystem stakeholders to maybe think about how MSME-oriented or targeted solutions could become more affordable, because many of the solutions are actually geared towards larger companies. So there's one SME or a startup that's serving that large company. But if you think about the SME dispersion around the region, it's 98% of the businesses. So there's a large underserved market. They do obviously have appetite concerns with respect to affordability, but actually part of the role is for investors to also step up. Now, it doesn't mean that VCs are the only ones. So taking the onus a little bit away from you, I think it has to be sort of a blended packaged facility, right? So it could be catalytic investors. It could be, the typical VCs coming in at a later stage. And then there could be sort of growth stage investors that come in at a later time. But I think from philanthropic capital to commercial capital, there should be a way to blend in such a way that these solutions can become affordable.
Cool. Thanks for the onus on me as well, but that's absolutely right. All right. We do have time for a question if there is one. Yes, your name and affiliation, and then your question.
Thank you for the panel. My name is Kenny from Malaysia. I have a question in terms of impact-driven fundings for impact-driven companies, right? So imagine this situation when sustainability and ESG is becoming more mainstream. You have more investors flocking to the scene, trying to fund these impact-driven startups. But most often, they might still have this hat thinking that these impact startups should be like a tech startup. They should grow like, let's say, 10x if I invest this money in a period of 3 to 5 years. But on the flip side, the company themselves, they wanted to grow and they already have profit, but then they are not expecting this exponential growth, like let's say in terms of 10x, because they've been working on a particular issue and a community for long time. So my question to the panel is that how can both sides resolve this tension while more and more impact-driven companies are beginning to grow and they need to look for that right kind of funding to help them to grow in this journey as well? Thank you.
I'll take that as moderator first, I guess. It comes down to capital market efficiency. And there's not a one-size-fits-all capital investor looking for a project. Some are more seeking greater returns and are willing to take higher risk, and some are willing to take off on the upside trajectory in exchange for more sustainable path. And so I think here it requires, yes, founders to actually reflect on, should they take any money that comes to them? I know it's hard for founders to turn away money, especially after they've been struggling for so long, but having that real sit-down reflection with themselves and the rest of their team is important. And on the other side of it, investors as well, being real and not pushing for unsustainable possibilities. It's actually, I think, the investor's responsibility more than the founders to understand what the trade-offs are between taking more or less money and setting higher or lower targets. So that's kind of a high-level theoretical answer. And we have, in practice, declined certain opportunities because there was a substantial mismatch one way or the other. Usually it's the entrepreneurs not going for that 10x. We're actually aiming for 100x outcomes, but usually they're not aiming because they're not aiming high enough. But sometimes because we think they cannot achieve the growth that they're talking about without taking substantial shortcuts. And in that case, we pull off as well. Anybody else like to add anything?
Yeah, I think this is going to bring a whole lot of new people to invest in this space, but I absolutely think there's no way we can rely on venture. I think a lot of venture success is the visions are written in hindsight, so they look really back rather than really actually imagining it at the time. I think it's got to be looked completely differently. I don't think there's going to be a single protein company in the world that supplies all the protein. Then there's going to be hundreds. There's not going to be a single car company, battery company, hydrogen, electrification. There's going to be hundreds. So your balance sheet's going to look different. Your journey's going to look different. So your investments should look different as well. So I think this is, sadly for Australia, the knee-jerk reaction is to go look for venture capital. And we say to people, you've got to go elsewhere. We're getting a great response actually by going to industry. If you're working on proteins, go to people who maybe worked on farming in different ways, or working in the fast-moving consumer goods in chips, or approaching a different group of people because they won't think like venture capital, because you just won't get the same returns. But also, we're doing all of this and working it out as we go. So everyone has to be pretty flexible. So I think any VC who's in it is thinking, even if they pitched a 10-year plan and this is exactly how it's going to work, no, everyone is absolutely recognising that like every year everything changes. So I think we need some boldness. And one of the biggest positives I think in terms of that boldness is generational wealth change. And it goes back to that youth side again. I think we're certainly seeing in Australia, and we've seen in Europe and in North America as well, wealth being passed on to the next generation, and they have different views, and that's an opportunity, I think, to engage in people in a different way.
We have been given time for one more question. I saw 5 hands, so the first one that goes up gets it. Oh, everybody's scared of the time limit now, sorry. There we go. Name and affiliation first, please.
Thanks. I'm Christy Getman with SNV, the Netherlands Development Organization. I feel like you guys have really made the case for the why, especially for startups, to invest in ESG, but can you talk a little bit about the how? Last year's conference, there was a lot of discussion about the gap in ability to fund the technical assistance and the know-how for startups to know how to go on this journey together. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about opportunities or successes of how startups especially can find the capital to help with the technical assistance investment and or the gaps that you still see in the market.
Yeah, I think one challenge we jammed on earlier was, especially for the earliest stage of startup, you're just 2 founders working out of a garage, doing your first cricket farming, what have you, right? And so how can you even think about starting to put together an ESG policy? And it's just the fact of business building that you have to start by building your product and building your customer. But the sooner you think about ESG early on, and we encourage all of our startups on this actually, is the sooner you start to think about these questions, the sooner you're thinking about these questions. So that's step number 1, is to actually have that say, this matters on your capital journey. We might not really be caring about your 113 question and survey results yet, but we know there are downstream investors who will. Now, the gap, as your question is, how do we get from just basic awareness of ESG is important to implementing it gradually over time? I'm going to pass for this one over to Temasek Trust.
Yeah, I can maybe attempt, but I don't think there's a single answer to that question either, right? So I would think that maybe depending on the different nuances of a particular industry or a particular country, there is a need to look at the role of industry associations who are very much closer to the topic of that particular sector. Now, that plays out differently in different markets. In Singapore, it has played out differently, where we've partnered with the Singapore Fashion Council, for instance. So there's sort of an attempt to build a sectoral plan for SMEs in the fashion and textile space to then help develop sort of a toolkit and sort of playbooks and guidebooks, both from the awareness, so the workshopping side of things, to essentially doing clinics, ESG clinics, essentially. It's sort of a diagnostics instrument, and then taking that to some of the implementation. So that is a very specific example in the context of one country, one industry association. Another example could look like in the context of a corporate that works closely with its suppliers. I think in the context of many companies I had spoken with over the last 12 months, they were the likes of companies like Mars or Watson's who have actually gone down and supporting some of their tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. That is unlikely for every company to go ahead and take that direction. So I think the appetite for that may vary, but there's a role for maybe different ecosystem stakeholders to take a slightly different approach. Maybe financing institutions and banks are the other ones, because there is sort of the rise in one of the panels we had heard previously about the sustainability-linked loans and how sort of uptake of that can be linked to financing outcomes for the organization. So I think there are some of these stepping stones, but I don't think it's one ecosystem. It maybe is not even one village. It maybe takes multiple villages to come together to bring an SME in that direction.
If I could also add, so like what Akhil mentioned, banks in Singapore, like OCBC, for example, they have like sustainability compass, they have financing programs and capacity building to help you as SMEs and founders to get started. But also, I came across Antler. Ross Bazzani at Antler has spent so much time creating this amazing sustainability toolkit, which is open source. It's modularized, so founders can access it so that's something I thought was pretty cool. So yeah, banks and open
it's
source.
It's a Notion website, so it is actually a pretty good one. Yeah, the Antler playbook, right, on ESG.
Yeah, I think for our case, So actually, it really depends on what kind of business you are and what kind of startup or what sectors that you have your foundation when you started the business. So for us, it's like just family cricket itself is very much aligned with the whole SDG goals and the framework. But for us, we did receive a lot of support, both from ecosystem, but also from the governmental level. For example, very sadly, that program finished, but we did got our first ever ESG training to understand ESG different from social responsibility. So it's a very basic thing. Very sad, like that program terminated, but that was one of the very first knowledge and understanding for us to start building our ESG platform. And then later on, when we trying to realize, like, quantify our work, replacing the whole traditional conventional reporting way, then we got into support from the Australian government, like DFAT, to run our first test model with the real-time sensoring, like monitoring and recording. So I think Vietnam, I think we are very blessed to be operating in a very supporting and healthy environment where we can test and realize our idea when it comes to ESG.
Really quick add for me is I've never seen an industry that has so much incumbent interest at early stage. So they're really big companies. They know there's a massive transition going on. They're a little bit fearful. It's a little bit complex, but they are really engaging early and running a lot of programs, investing early. And I actually think my guess is, and if I'm right about this, please remember, if I'm wrong, just forget it, but that 2027 is going to be an absolute boom year for climate technologies. And I think there's trillions of dollars sitting there waiting as dry powder to acquire hundreds and possibly thousands of these companies. So I think it's a very different asset class, done in a different way, but the incumbents are engaging really early.
All right, we are really out of time now. But thanks so much, everybody, for your comments. Thanks for listening. Have a good rest of the day.